Genesis 44, we're right back in the middle of the conflict between Joseph and his brothers in their reunion. The famine has become very severe. If you remember, Joseph had interpreted a dream of Pharaoh's, or two dreams of Pharaoh's, that said there's going to be a famine, and the famine is going to last 7 years, but before that you're going to have 7 good years. And Joseph suggested that during those times of good years we should lay by in store, collect, that way when the 7 years of famine come, we can actually be able to provide not only for ourselves and our people, but for all the rest of the world who need it. And Joseph I think Joseph has a master's degree in business administration. You know, it just seems like every time there's a challenge, he finds a way to make profit and money from it. And we'll see that tonight as well in some things that Joseph does to set the Egyptians and the Egyptian rulers up for success. And so the brothers come needing to buy grain. The famine is bad. They need food, and there's nowhere to get it other than Egypt. So they come in, and Joseph, as we saw last Wednesday night, Joseph says, "You're spies. I don't trust you." And they barter back and forth about, "We're not spies, we're not spies, we're not spies." And Joseph says, "All right, here's how you're going to prove it. You say that you have another brother who's not with you. Go back and bring him," which would have been Benjamin, Joseph's full brother. "Go back and bring him, and then I'll believe you." Well, then they come back with Benjamin. And Joseph has this elaborate scheme to put his brothers in the same situation that they put him in all those years ago. And so chapter 44 begins with Joseph telling his attendants, "Fill up their grain sacks, put their money back in the sacks, and then put my cup in Benjamin's sack." And we'll talk about the cup and the significance of that here in just a minute. But the attendants do this, and the brothers kind of go on their merry little way, thinking that they've paid the money, and they've gotten the grain, and everything is the way it should be. And then Joseph does, I can't help but read parallels in the Bible when the stories sound similar. Joseph does a very similar thing to what Pharaoh does in the Exodus. He lets his people go and then chases right after them. Right? So that's what Joseph does. He lets the brothers go, they get a little bit of a head start, and then he sends the squad after them to stop them and check their bags, and eventually it's going to be found out that the money is there and the cup is in Benjamin's bag. Now, Joseph, when he does this, or rather I should say Judah, when he does this, is obviously dumbfounded. They have no idea what's happening. They did not do any of this. They don't know what's happening behind the scenes. They don't know Joseph's plan in all this. And so they start panicking. And Joseph and Judah start bartering over what the punishment's going to be. From Judah's perspective and the rest of the brothers' perspective, whether they did or not, the evidence points that they have robbed the second in command in Egypt. It's not exactly a light thing that you do, right? And so they start bartering back and forth, and Joseph says, "Okay, the one who had the cup in the bag, I'm going to keep as my slave." And Judah says, "Take me instead, right? Take me as your slave. Let Benjamin go back, because if he doesn't go back, it's going to kill our father. Let me be your slave." Now, that's interesting, because Judah, if you remember back in chapter 37 and verse 26, was the one responsible for selling Joseph into slavery. My, how the tables have turned. And that's what we as the readers are to pick up on here. That Judah was the one who sold Joseph, or whose idea it was to sell Joseph into slavery. Let's go back through that process of Genesis chapter 37. Joseph comes to his brothers. They're out keeping the sheep and shepherding. They have a hatred for him because he said that they would all bow to him. And he's the youngest, next to Benjamin, of course, but the youngest there. And they say, "Let's kill him." Reuben speaks up and says, "No, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in a well." And Reuben said this because he wanted to come back and free Joseph eventually. Well, while Joseph is sitting there in the well, Judah says, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, which ultimately leads him into Egypt. Now, Judah is willing to sell himself into slavery in order to protect his youngest brother. Do you see the irony there? It bears mentioning as well that slavery in the ancient world, while different than our own modern context in our recent past 200 years or so, was a part of their world. And it's difficult for us sometimes to read that. And in fact, some translations have even taken out the word slave and put in the word servant because it's sort of more politically correct, I suppose. But the Hebrew and Greek word, for this, it would be a slave. And you became a slave in the ancient world in one of three ways. Number one, you were a prisoner of war. So if you're taken captive, you become a slave. Number two, you have a debt. And in that case, maybe you have a debt you can't pay off, and so you sell yourself into slavery until the debt's paid off, and then you can be released. Or number three, you're born into it, and so if you're a slave, if your parents are slaves, you are also a slave. And you can become free in both ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman cultures, depending on the time. But that's how you become a slave. Now, Judah doesn't really fit well into either of those three categories, but Judah does fit well in the criminal slave sense. So if you're a criminal, instead of dying, you could work off your sentence by being a slave. And that's what Judah wants to do. So we are to immediately, as we read this, think about Joseph and Potiphar. Joseph was a slave in Potiphar's house. He rose to the position of second over Potiphar's household. Potiphar only had to concern himself with what he was going to eat and drink that day. Right? That's what the text says. Everything else was entrusted to Joseph. But Joseph was still a slave. High on the hierarchy as he was still a slave. And now Judah is wanting to become that slave as well. Okay, so Joseph will not let up. And Joseph says, I'm not going to accept this. The only way we're going to resolve this is if Benjamin stays as my slave. Right? That's the kicker for Joseph. Now, that's how chapter 44 ends. In chapter 45, we'll see Joseph's revelation of himself to his brothers, but we'll get that in just a minute. There are a couple of things that I think are important for us to maybe wrap our minds around with chapter 44 as we get into the narrative of chapter 45. And one of those is the question, why would Joseph go to all this trouble? Why stage these issues? Why put the money back in the sacks and put his cup in Benjamin's sack and send his servants after them and have them arrested and go through all this back and forth with Judah? Why not just immediately reveal himself to his brothers? I mean, it's clear from what we read last week in those chapters 40 through 43, that Joseph still had a love for his brothers. He didn't call for his brothers to be killed. He didn't say, no, you can't have anything. He took care of his brothers, and even a few times in the text it says that his emotions kind of ran high. And we left them in chapter 43 eating and drinking together. Right? And so the question might be, why not just tell them right then? Why go to such an elaborate scheme? And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. What Joseph does with Benjamin is he endangers the life of the most vulnerable brother. Benjamin is the youngest. And perhaps Benjamin, we might say, is now replaced Joseph in the eyes of Jacob as the most loved child. Right? So he's the most vulnerable, he's the most loved. And Joseph, by doing this, sets the stage to do the opposite of what was done to him. At the time when Joseph was 17, Joseph was the most vulnerable of the sons. Let's exclude Benjamin from the conversation for a minute. Joseph is the most vulnerable. And what happens to the most vulnerable is he's sold into slavery. It's said that he's dead. They ultimately thought he would die, or at least be killed or something like that. The stage then is flipped with Benjamin. If Benjamin is going to serve as a slave in Joseph's household, in Egypt, chances are he's probably going to die. He's not going to be cared for. He might even be abused. That's just the way things work. And it's a terrible reality, but it's reality nonetheless. But what Joseph is going to do, spoiler alert, most of you probably know this story anyways, is Joseph is going to give forgiveness and grace and mercy, which is something that was not given to him by his brothers. Okay, so that's what Joseph is doing. He's setting the stage. Now, another very small and very minute issue in this text, and if you're just reading it in your daily Bible reading, you might have read over it a couple of times, is the issue of the cup. What kind of cup was this? Well, the text says in verse 5, "Doesn't my master drink from this cup and use it for divination?" Okay, that's interesting because remember we saw several weeks ago when Jacob was with Laban that Laban, he didn't practice divination, but he inquired of a diviner. Right? Laban went like every day to the soothsayer and figured out what his fortune was. He read his horoscope every day, basically, is what the text is trying to tell us. And that, in the law of Moses, is completely forbidden. You are not to inquire of soothsayers. You are not to practice divination. You are not to practice witchcraft. And yet here we have Joseph, which this, to be fair, is before the law of Moses. And we have Joseph using a tool, this cup, to practice divination. So here's my point with this. This is not just Joseph's favorite cup. I have 2 cups that I drink out of at my house. I have one that is a Yeti tumbler that says TriStar Auction Group on it, and I have another one that I bought from a buddy of mine. It's a Stanley Cup that I bought from Jacob Farr. That dude cost me so much money. It was at an auction contest, and he was competing, and I wanted to help him, and I wound up getting stuck with it. And so I use those. Those are my cups. Out of all the hundreds of cups we have in our house, those are the 2 that I use. This is not what Joseph is talking about. That's not his special cup. What makes the cup special is what it's used for. It's a cup of divination, perhaps used to read things like tea leaves, or maybe to look in and see something about how the liquid changes or moves in the cup, something like that. But the issue is that divination is forbidden in the law of Moses, and of course this is before the law of Moses, so what are we to make of that with Joseph? Well, did Joseph really practice divination? It depends on your definition of divination. And part of that is because Joseph is a dream interpreter. Remember, when he comes to Egypt, he interprets dreams. When he moves into Pharaoh's household and is shown favor by the Pharaoh, he changes his clothes, he shaves himself, he's given a wife who is the daughter of a priest of On, or the priest of Heliopolis, which is where the sun god, the temple to the sun god is. Joseph is in all respects a priest of Egypt. That's how we're to view him. And so whether or not his dream interpretation is viewed in his historical context as an act of the gods, meaning the gods of Egypt, or an act of God, Yahweh, it doesn't matter. Joseph has a special ability to see into the divine with dream interpretation. And so, in that sense, he is someone who practices divination. I'm not convinced that he is someone who practices divination in the way the priest of Egypt would do it, because we're never told that Joseph does anything magical, so to speak. His supernatural ability is to interpret dreams. And he doesn't have to look at anything or use any tools to do that. And in fact, Joseph even admits, if I can find it here, let's see. I think I have this written down. Yeah, okay. Joseph admits that he does not need any tools to practice divination, and that he does it on a regular basis. So if you look at verse 15, it says, Joseph said to them, "What do you think you were doing? Don't you know that a man like me can find out these things by divination?" Okay. Well, so he can find it out without having his cup. Now, the moral of all this, first of all, two things. First of all, don't read over the text if it doesn't fit with your theology. Okay? I've shared this with you before. I have a professor who is the chairman of my dissertation committee, and he says, I'm not a theologian, I'm a biblist. Meaning I don't have to make myself believe and fit different things into how I believe about the Bible. If the Bible says it, the Bible means it in its given context, and my job is to accept that. So the text here very clearly says that Joseph was someone who practiced divination. My point with all this, number two, is that the Israelites, from the time of Joseph to the time that they come into the land of Canaan after the Exodus, it's like the book of Joshua and Judges, shows them being assimilated to Egyptian culture. And when you understand that, and if you do just a little bit of study into Egyptian culture, it makes the law of Moses so much clearer to read. So, for example, I need to move on, I'm sorry, but in the law of Moses, can't eat catfish. Okay? If you eat a fish, it has to have scales and fins. Right? So you can't eat catfish. Now, I love catfish. Catfish is one of the greatest fish to ever be eaten, especially if it's fried right. Well, what's wrong with eating a catfish? Well, what was the staple diet of the Egyptians? Nile catfish. Right? So everything about your culture, and culture is defined by its food in a lot of senses, right? Tonight, if you all go out to eat, you might go to eat at a Chinese restaurant or a Mexican restaurant or a Greek restaurant. Okay, food is culturally identifying, and so they had to leave the culturally identifying foods of Egypt and start having their own. Now, so all that to say, we see a shift here into Egyptian assimilation. And we see that very clearly with Joseph. Okay, chapter 45 then. Now, Joseph is going to reveal himself to his brothers. We've waited a long time for this. If we're watching this like a movie playing out on a screen, we're building up right to the pinnacle of the climax. And it's very exciting to see Joseph reveal himself to his brothers, and maybe we imagine the look on their face and the surprise that they had. So Joseph just can't hold it in anymore. He sends everybody out. Joseph isn't a very emotional guy. He sends everybody out, and he has this kind of emotional breakdown. And even though he sent everybody out, the whole world knows about it. And the Bible says that those in his palace heard about it. And everybody knows what's going on. They know something's wrong with Joseph. They just don't know exactly what. And Joseph then reveals himself to his brothers in verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Now, they've already told him that their father's still alive. And so now maybe by revealing himself, what Joseph is really asking is, are you going to be the men of honesty that you said you were just a few chapters ago? Remember when they first come into Egypt and want to buy grain from Joseph, they say, we're honest men, and then proceed to lie. Right? And so now Joseph might be testing that by asking about their father. Joseph reveals himself, and at that time, Joseph can't hold in his emotions toward Benjamin any longer. You see in verse 14 that he throws himself on Benjamin and he weeps on him and he kisses Benjamin and just has a great love for his brother. Benjamin is his full brother. Benjamin is the only one of the brothers that didn't do anything to act against Joseph. And if Joseph was 17 when he was sold into slavery, I have no idea how old Benjamin was. We might imagine Benjamin was relatively young. Now, what's so interesting about this passage is the attitude that Joseph has toward his brothers. I've held a lot more of a grudge for a lot less. And Joseph has this great ability to forgive. One of the reasons he has that ability to forgive is because he sees how God has worked all these things in his life together for good. I think that maybe we should put a little marginal note in our Bibles here beside Genesis 45 to reference Romans chapter 8. It says that God works all things together for good to those who love Him. That doesn't mean that your life will be good if you love the Lord. It means that God will work all things together for good to those who love Him. Right? Well, Joseph's life certainly wasn't all good. Joseph's life was a roller coaster. He had his highs and he had his lows, and his highs were really high and his lows were really low. But God was able to orchestrate all those things together to bring him to this specific purpose of caring for his family, of caring for God's elect people. Now, would the Egyptians be taken care of? Sure. Would the surrounding nations be taken care of? Of course. But the purpose was to care for God's elect people. Now, it takes a spiritually mature person to be able to look back over the course of your life and see the good and the bad and see God orchestrating it together. It takes a very spiritually mature person, because what tends to happen is when bad things happen, we blame God, and when good things happen, we forget God. And someone who's spiritually mature can look back over the course of their life and say, God was in this, whether it was good or bad. To God be the glory, and God will preserve. When you pass through the fire, you'll not be burned. When you pass through the waters, they'll not overcome you. The fire and the waters are going to be there. But when you pass through them, so is God. He's going to be there with you. That's a great comfort. I think sometimes, though, we want to read that to say the fire and the water will never come. That's not what the text says. Maybe we here think a little bit about Esther. Esther is such an interesting book of the Bible. We've studied it in this class before. It's the only book of the Old Testament where the name of God, the name Yahweh, does not appear. It's nowhere to be found at all in the book of Esther. But the interesting thing about Esther is you see God at work, because God has orchestrated Esther's life to such a way that she will be called to a purpose, and she will have the choice of acting. And Mordecai tells Esther, it's up to you. You can, if you do nothing, God will take care of His people some other way, which is a great statement of faith. But who knows? Maybe you were brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. Right? This is the most famous passage in Esther. And so God can orchestrate our lives to work these things together for good. Now that brings up an interesting theological question, one that I can't pretend to exhaust tonight, but maybe something to think about. And that is the question of, how does the providence of God and our free will work together? I want to ask you to do an exercise with me, and that is to just look back over the course of your life, however long that is, and look at the fundamental key things that brought you to be where you are today. And I want to share my story with you, if you'll allow me for just a minute, to share with you the reason I'm standing up here and serving as a minister for Salem Creek. So my mom and dad didn't grow up in the church. They became Christians around the time that I was born, thereabouts. And so I grew up in the church. We attended church at the Spring Hill Church of Christ. And Mom and Dad decided to move to Unionville. When we did, we started going to church with my aunt and uncle at the East Side Church of Christ in Chebville. Through a series of unfortunate events, I guess I'll say, family decided to leave, and we started going to church just a couple miles down the road at a small congregation in Christiana, the New Zion Church of Christ. Brother H.A. Beasley, who is now my neighbor, was the preacher there at the time. H.A. and Ron were roommates at Freed Hardeman. I did not know what Freed Hardeman was. I'd never heard about it. Really didn't know what it was until I was probably a sophomore in high school. And then decided that preaching is actually something that you can do and get a degree in and do for a living. And felt like that's what I needed to do. And so Freed Hardeman came into my path that way. But I would not have been able to go to Freed Hardeman had it not been for H.A. and Ron. Because H.A. told me about this thing called the Preacher Scholarship Fund that Minerva Drive had. And so I applied for it and interviewed, and I'm humbled and proud at the same time to tell you I've been a recipient of that since 2012. And I'm still getting it to help out with the PhD studies. Well, being a recipient of the scholarship meant that I had to come once a semester and preach. And that led to an interview. And that led to a job. And that led to today. That led to me meeting my wife. None of that would have happened had Mom and Dad not got mad and left Eastside and gone to New Zion. You know? It's crazy to me to think about how God has directed my life to be where I'm at. And maybe you can say the same. Not maybe. You can say the same. Where God has directed your steps for you to be here where you are now. It's a very interesting thing. Now, all that to say with the providence of God and the free will of man. Some theological doctrines put things like predestination way far and above what the Bible says. The Bible never talks about God predestining one person. It's always a group. Ephesians chapter 1 talks about the election and predestination of the church, not about individual Christians. God had to make man with free will. And the reason is because God is a loving God and He wants His creation to love Him back. And love is a free choice. Gentlemen, if you were dating your wife and you decided to kidnap her and throw her in the basement in a cage, duct taped, and chained up, that's not love. Love must be freely given and it must be freely received. And so if God's going to make humanity where humanity has the option of loving God, it has to be an option. Okay? So humanity has free will. I think the best way to describe the relationship between free will and the providence of God is that God puts instances in our path to which we then have the option of choosing. Joseph did not have to pardon his brothers. Esther did not have to go to the king and try to get things fixed for her people. But God had orchestrated their lives to where they would come to that choice. And the same for us. We face those choices every day, and our choices may be different than others. So I think here there's a very simple way to think about the providence of God and the free will of humanity. It seems to be the case that the things that we perceive in life that might be the very worst thing that could happen to us can work out for the goodness not only of ourselves, but for the glory of God. And I say that not lightly, because there are many people, perhaps in this room, maybe watching online, there are many people who are going through what might well be the worst time of their lives right now. And that has a way of clouding our vision for how God could ever do anything good with us. And I just can't help but think about Joseph sitting in prison for 2 years waiting for the cupbearer to tell Pharaoh about him. Could you imagine the depression and anxiety that Joseph might have felt? I can't help but imagine how Joseph must have felt when Potiphar's wife accused him of rape. And how that might have been a very low point in his life. If we keep God at the center of it and we understand that God does work all things together for good for those who love Him, those things can be a doorway that lead us to peace, joy, and fulfillment. It becomes part of our story. Think about the last motivational speaker that you heard, maybe on a podcast or for a business or whatever. It's probably someone who started out life as an absolute heathen and then got their life turned around. Well, why is that? It's because they have a story. And your story is important. My story is important. Okay, now, The brothers go back and they tell their father, Joseph is alive. When they do, Joseph sends them back with wagons and chariots and food and livestock and all of these incredible blessings from Egypt. And so the brothers come back and they find Jacob and they say, your son Joseph is alive. And Jacob says, no, he ain't. You're lying to me. I don't believe this. And I find that, ironic. Maybe funny isn't the right word, but I find it ironic because those same brothers came back all those years ago with a coat dipped in goat's blood and said, your son Joseph is dead. That's really not a lot of evidence, is it? I mean, it's a coat with a little bit of blood on it. Jacob doesn't send out a search party. They don't go look for his body. All they have is the coat dipped in goat's blood. And Jacob says, yep, you're right, he's dead. Little bit of evidence, immediately believes it. Now, you have a ton of evidence, the chariots, the wagons, the food, the livestock, all this stuff from Egypt. And then Jacob isn't willing to believe it, at least at first. So he has a hard time with that. Now, one final thing, and we'll move on. We'll probably end with chapter 46 tonight. Don't underestimate the role that you have regarding the well-being of your family. Family is a difficult thing. And like I said, I have held grudges for a lot longer over a lot less. And a lot of that is directed at members of my family. Y'all heard the statement, you might be the only Bible somebody reads today. It's very true, especially with our family. I wonder sometimes if Joseph might have wished that his brothers would die. If Joseph might have wished that his brothers would have been hurt or something bad would have happened to them. It's only a natural response for all the mess that happened to him. But Joseph makes it clear to them in chapter 45. The reason all this happened was so I could be the one to preserve our people. Forget the Egyptians. It was all about the preservation of God's chosen, elect people. So the word family in that sentence might mean our blood relatives. I think for us, more than anything, it means our church family. That we are entrusted to care for one another, to pray for one another, and for goodness sakes, it's a hard thing to do, but to put up with one another. People are people. Maybe the challenges that happen to us can be used for the well-being of our family. Okay, chapter 46 then. Chapter 46 begins with God and Jacob having a conversation. Now, we have not seen a conversation between God and Jacob for several chapters. It says in verse 1, so Israel began his journey. Remember, Israel is the same name for Jacob. Israel began his journey, taking with him all that he had. When he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Now, do you all remember what we said about Jacob in the Jacob narrative? Jacob rarely ever offers sacrifices. He's a rock raiser. He builds monuments to signify an event, but he's not very good about giving God something from himself. So this is very important, and he's near the end of his life now. He offers sacrifices to God. God spoke to Israel in a vision during the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he replied, here I am. He said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid. Go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself will certainly bring you back from there. Joseph will close your eyes. Remember, God told Abraham in Abraham's call that his people would be in Egypt and that they would be enslaved there and that eventually they would be brought out. Notice here that while God tells Jacob to go to Egypt. He never told him to stay. Could things have changed? Well, probably not, because God had prophesied about it, and of course God is true and all-knowing, and so it's going to be the way that it is. But what was the fundamental problem with the people of Israel in Egypt? We're jumping ahead now to like the end of Genesis, the beginning of Exodus, but the fundamental problem is God allowed them to go, God didn't tell them to stay, and then they do stay. They get comfortable in the land of Goshen. And Goshen is Egypt. Okay, I know in the Bible we try to separate the two, but the land of Goshen is controlled by Egypt. And so they settle there. And not only that, we'll see in chapter 47, probably not tonight, but when we get there, that they had jobs. So not only do they now have land, they have a career. And what are the two fundamental things you have to have in order to raise a family, at least in an idealistic sense? You need to have a way to make money and have to have a place to put things. Right? Well, that's what they have. They've got a way to make money and a place to put it. And so they settle. And in the book of Genesis, settling in one place is never the ideal. That's what happens at Babel, right? In Genesis chapter 11. God says, be fruitful and multiply and scatter over the face of the earth. And then the people came together and they weren't fruitful, they didn't multiply, and they were in one centralized location. And so God confused their language so that they would scatter and multiply. So that's an issue. God said, go to Egypt. Never said stay. And God tells Jacob, I'm going to bring you back from there. There's a couple of ways to interpret you. Is he saying, I will bring you as in your people, or I will bring you as in you singular? And I think here, because we're talking about Jacob dying in Egypt and Joseph being there to witness that, we're talking about you singular. I'm going to bring you out here. Meaning, your body is not going to stay in Egypt. You're going to be gathered to your fathers, gathered to your people, right? And of course, afterlife ritual was certainly a huge thing in that day. Okay, so Jacob and his family come into Egypt. The numbers here are confusing, to say the least. I'm not a mathematician. I'm going to explain this the best that I can. I encourage you, if this explanation is unsatisfactory, get a commentary. 66 people go into Egypt. Okay? That does not count it says that 70 go into Egypt. But if you count, 66 actually go into Egypt. There's a couple that are missing. Of course, Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh aren't included in that number. The two sons of Judah that have died are not included in that number, which we saw back in 38, I believe it was. The two wives of Jacob that are the handmaidens for Rachel and Leah are not included. Okay, so that leaves you with 66. So we have 66 that go in, and then we have 70, the text says, that are in Egypt when everybody's all together. But if you count, it's not 70, it's 75. And the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, doesn't say 70, it says 75. Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7 says 75. Stephen would have been using the Septuagint. So the question is this a contradiction or not? And the answer is, it depends on how you view the numbers. I will tell you straight up, I think biblical numerology is a joke. There are some numbers in the Bible that have some theological significance, but overall, biblical numerology is a joke. That said, the numbers that have some significance are the number 6 and the number 7. 6 is a number for incomplete things. Well, what is it with the 66 that go into Egypt? They're an incomplete family. Why are they incomplete? Because Joseph and Ephraim and Manasseh are in Egypt. Right? So they're not unified yet. When they get in Egypt, we're told that we have 70. Well, 75. But why do we use 70? Because the number 7 and the number 10 are symbolic for completion. And so you have 7 sets of 10, it's like the most complete that you can be. That's why Jesus says that when you forgive 70 times 7. Right? Because it's to the fullest, to the nth degree that you forgive. All right? Now, like I said, biblical numerology is a joke. But number 6, number 7, number 10, and number 40. Those are the big ones. All right? Those are the big ones. So, that may help us. Let's do one more thing and be done for tonight. At the end, in verse 30 through 34, we'll read this real quick. Israel said to Joseph, "Let me die since I have seen your face, and I know that you're still alive." Then Joseph said to his brothers, "This is my father's household. I will go up and tell Pharaoh, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, and they take care of livestock, and they brought their flocks and their herds, and all that they have. Pharaoh will summon you and say, 'What is your occupation?' Tell him that you're shepherds, basically, and you live in the land of Goshen. For everyone who takes care of sheep is disgusting to the Egyptians." Okay. We saw earlier that the role of shepherd was a disgusting job to the Egyptians. The Egyptians were very clean people, and being a shepherd is very nasty. And so, what do we have here? Well, the children of Israel are going to come and settle in the land of Goshen. Goshen is Egypt, but now we're talking about it as a whole separate place. What we find and what we've been finding since Jacob, remember Jacob had that sort of dichotomy between him and Laban. It's Laban the Aramean, and then you have Jacob, and then you have Joseph and the Egyptians. Now you have the Israelites in the land of Goshen and Egypt. So we're putting this dividing wall between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. I bring this up because what I said earlier. When you read the text and see the people of Israel, particularly in the Exodus, they are unquestionably Egyptian culturally. But when you zoom out and read the theology of the text, they're their own group. And what the Exodus then does is shows how God takes people who are culturally assimilated in one way and makes them His nation.